Hello, I'm Dr. Dilarom. Welcome to this summary and educational video regarding my new book, What Does It Mean to Say I'm an Empath? You can purchase the book in both ebook and paperback formats on Amazon KDP and Barnes & Noble. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and please leave a comment and a like if you enjoy the videos. Now, I'll hand things over to my friend Kate, who helped me with the voiceover. Enjoy the video, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Dilarom. I am very happy to be doing this voiceover. Enjoy the show, everyone. And here we go. What does it mean to say, I'm an empath? Imagine walking into a kitchen where two people have just stopped talking. Nothing is said. No one is crying. No voices were raised. Nothing looks out of place. The coffee is still warm on the counter. A chair is pushed back slightly further than it needs to be, and yet you know almost instantly that something has happened. You couldn't say exactly how you know. You simply do. The same way you know a room is cold before you've consciously registered the temperature, the same way you can tell from 3 rooms away that a house has gone quiet in a way that isn't restful. This is the moment nearly every conversation about being an empath secretly starts from. Not a diagnosis, not a quiz. A moment exactly like this one. Small, wordless, and completely undeniable. Picture a second scene. A coworker sits down, opens a laptop, says, "Good morning," in a voice that sounds completely normal. And within minutes, you know something is wrong. Nobody has said anything. Nothing on the agenda changed. The knowledge just arrives, uninvited, oddly complete. Now a third, a tense phone call with a parent ends at 8 in the morning. Nothing was resolved. Nothing was screamed. By any objective measure, it was an ordinary, forgettable 10 minutes. And yet the flatness of it follows you into the shower, onto the train, into a meeting that has nothing to do with either of you. A fourth scene, you're at a party, nobody upset you, nothing dramatic happened. You liked the people, enjoyed the conversation, laughed at least once, and you still end up standing outside afterward, more depleted than the evening seems to explain. A fifth, a friend tells you about a hard month, and it doesn't leave when the conversation ends. It's still faintly there the next morning, like a weather system that rolled in from somewhere else and simply decided to stay. And a sixth, the one almost everyone in this territory has heard at least once, usually meant as an insult. You're too sensitive. Too sensitive to a comment that wasn't that harsh. Too sensitive to a mood nobody else in the room seemed to notice. As if sensitivity itself were the flaw. Hold on to all 6 of those. They matter again at the very end. If any of them sound familiar, you've probably come across a word that claims to explain all 6 at once. Empath. It shows up in online quizzes, self-help articles, entire communities built around the idea. And here is where this is going to do something most content on this subject doesn't do. It is not going to tell you whether you're an empath. Not because that would take too long to figure out. Because the question itself was never built the way it sounds like it was built. It sounds like a yes or no question with a hidden checklist behind it. It isn't one. What's actually behind that feeling? Where someone else's mood becomes your mood, where a stranger's grief tightens your throat, where a room full of people leaves you flattened for no dramatic reason, turns out to be several different things, each with its own explanation, its own research, and its own answer for where it comes from. That's the real subject here, not whether you qualify for a label. What is actually happening in your body and your history every single time one of those 6 scenes plays out And by the end of this, you'll have a considerably clearer answer than any quiz, any online list, or any single flattering word could ever give you. Almost everything written about empaths online takes one of two shortcuts. Either it hands you a quiz and a percentage, as if the question could be settled the way a blood test settles an iron deficiency, or it swings the other way completely and tells you being an empath is simply a gift, no further questions needed. Both are more comfortable than the truth. Both, it turns out, are wrong in ways that quietly cost people something real. The quiz leaves you with a label and no actual understanding of what's driving your own experience. And when the label eventually stops feeling like enough, which it does for nearly everyone who has tried to lean on it during a genuinely hard week, there's nothing underneath to fall back on. The gift version is worse in a quieter way. It can turn real exhaustion, real burnout, real trouble holding a boundary into evidence of how deeply a person feels rather than a solvable problem with an actual mechanism behind it. But something stranger is waiting underneath both of those shortcuts, and it's the reason this particular word has exploded in popularity in just the last several years. Somewhere recently, you've probably scrolled past a list. 10 signs you might be an empath. You didn't go looking for it. But you read it anyway, and somewhere around the fourth or fifth item, a very specific feeling arrived. This is describing me. Here's where almost everyone gets this wrong. That feeling is real. It is not on its own evidence that the list was written specifically for you. Psychologists have understood for decades that broadly worded, mostly flattering descriptions feel personally accurate to almost anyone who reads them because they're built out of traits common enough to apply to nearly everyone who goes looking for themselves inside them. It's the exact mechanism behind horoscopes, personality quizzes, and cold readings. Here's a simple way to test this on yourself, right now, without needing any special equipment. Read this sentence slowly. You have a strong need for other people to like you, yet you tend to be critical of yourself. While you have some personality weaknesses, you're generally able to compensate for them. That description, or something extremely close to it, has been used in psychology classrooms for decades specifically because the overwhelming majority of people who read it rate it as surprisingly accurate about themselves, despite it being written to apply to almost anyone. If any part of it landed, that's the exact mechanism at work behind the empath quizzes, operating in miniature. There's a second force working alongside that one, and it has less to do with evidence and more to do with belonging. People define part of who they are through the groups they feel part of, long before any online community existed to formalize that instinct. A label with a ready-made community attached, forums, hashtags, a shared vocabulary, is going to feel truer than a label without one, regardless of how well it holds up under scrutiny. And here's the part that makes it self-reinforcing. Once a description gets adopted, even loosely, people don't just wait passively for new evidence to confirm or disconfirm it. They actively notice and remember the moments that fit, while the moments that don't fit quietly slide by, unregistered. That's not dishonesty. It's simply how identity works once any label, accurate or not, takes hold. Which means the strength of that feeling of recognition is not, by itself, reliable evidence that the underlying claim is true. None of this makes the 6 scenes you just heard fake. It means the label sitting on top of them deserves a far harder look than it usually gets, because underneath one popular word, several genuinely separate things are happening at once. And conflating them is exactly what keeps the real explanation out of reach. It helps to see where this specific word actually came from, because the timeline explains a lot. Empath existed for decades mostly as a term borrowed from science fiction, a character trope, a fictional ability rarely used to describe a real personality style. Its migration into everyday self-description tracks closely with two much larger cultural waves. The self-help publishing boom that took off in the 1970s and 80s, built partly on personality typing systems that let ordinary readers sort themselves into tidy categories, and a New Age wellness movement that borrowed the language of energy, auras, and intuition from older spiritual traditions and repackaged it for a mass audience. Worth noticing, too, empath isn't the first label to move through this exact cycle. Codependent went through nearly the same journey a generation earlier, a clinical-sounding term, borrowed loosely from addiction treatment literature that spread into everyday self-description faster than the underlying research could keep pace with. Highly sensitive person followed a similar path in the 1990s, coined by a researcher, then adopted far more broadly and far more loosely than the original research specified. Each of these labels captured something genuinely real about human variation. Each one also drifted, in popular use, considerably further from its evidence base than most people using it realize. Empath is simply the newest entry in that recurring pattern, not a new phenomenon on its own. Those two currents ran in parallel for decades, largely in print. Then came a third wave that changed the speed and scale of everything: short-form video. A personality label that once spread through a bookstore shelf now spreads through a 15-second clip, tested against millions of viewers in real time, refined automatically toward whichever version produces the strongest, fastest feeling of recognition. The underlying psychological mechanism: broad description, personal recognition, community reinforcement, is not new at all. What's new is the speed at which it now operates and the sheer volume of confirming content available at any hour of the day. So let's pull them apart, one at a time, starting with the fifth scene: the friend's bad month that won't leave you the next morning. Slow that one down, because it's a harder question than it looks. There are at least 3 separate things that could be happening, and they are not the same thing wearing different clothes. The first is accurately figuring out what someone else is thinking and feeling, the way a good detective reads a room without necessarily feeling any of it yourself. Researchers have studied this since the early 1980s under a broader name: theory of mind. The ability to recognize that other people hold beliefs, including false ones, that differ from your own. Psychologists call the empathy version of this cognitive empathy. The second is actually catching the feeling itself, the way a yawn spreads across a room, largely automatic, mostly outside conscious control, measurable from early infancy onward. This one has a name too: emotional contagion, sometimes grouped under the broader term affective empathy. And the third is caring about what happens to the other person, wanting things to get better for them specifically, which is a motivation, not a perception. Researchers call this empathic concern. Here's why this distinction matters immediately. A person can have any one of these without the other two. Someone can read you with total precision and feel nothing at all. Someone can catch your sadness like a cold without ever forming an accurate picture of why you're sad. Someone can care intensely about your welfare while badly misreading what you actually need in the moment. Three separate systems, routinely bundled under one word, almost never disentangled in ordinary conversation. That explains something that genuinely puzzles a lot of highly empathic people. Why they can be devastatingly accurate about a stranger's mood on a train and still get their own partner's feelings wrong on a regular basis. Different systems, different reliability, different situations in which each one actually turns on. Have you ever noticed that in your own life? Being remarkably good at reading a total stranger and strangely bad at reading someone you know intimately? If so, you've already brushed up against exactly this distinction without anyone ever naming it for you. Picture this playing out somewhere entirely different. A manager sitting across from an employee during a difficult performance conversation. One manager reads the employee's discomfort accurately, understands precisely why the feedback landed hard, and still delivers the necessary message clearly, because accurate reading and genuine concern for the employee's growth are both present and pointed in the same direction. A second manager reads the exact same discomfort with equal accuracy and uses that reading to soften the message into something vague and ultimately unhelpful because the accurate reading isn't paired with a clear sense of what actually serves the employee here. A third manager, lacking the accurate read entirely, plows through the conversation without noticing the discomfort at all, regardless of how much they might genuinely want the employee to succeed. Three managers, three different combinations of the same three underlying systems. Only one of those three conversations is likely to go well, and it isn't determined by how much any of them care, in some vague general sense. It's determined by whether accurate reading, genuine concern, and appropriate follow-through happen to be present together in the same moment, pointed at the same goal. That's the practical stake behind a distinction that can otherwise sound purely academic. Now back to the second scene, the coworker, the meeting, the knowledge that arrives before a single word confirms it. Here again, several explanations compete for the same experience, and nothing about the moment itself announces which one is operating. It could be genuine, fast, largely unconscious pattern recognition, years of accumulated experience reading faces, posture, and tone running so quickly it feels like intuition. It could be something closer to hypervigilance, a threat detection system tuned unusually high, often for reasons rooted in someone's own history rather than any special gift for reading others. Or, in a given case, some mixture of both. The actual research on this, called empathic accuracy, does find real, measurable differences between people. But some of the strongest findings come specifically from studying romantic couples discussing a live conflict, which is a very particular, high-stakes situation. It doesn't automatically transfer to reading a stranger across a subway car. A person can be excellent at one kind of read and unremarkable at another. There's a further wrinkle worth sitting with because it changes how the knowledge behaves once it arrives. An impression and its staying power are two different things. The moment in that meeting doesn't necessarily end when the meeting does. Whatever passed between you and your coworker that morning can keep quietly working on you for the rest of the day, which is exactly the shape of the third scene. It's worth picturing exactly how researchers study this, because the method itself is almost as interesting as the result. In a typical empathic accuracy study, two romantic partners are filmed separately discussing a real, unresolved conflict from their relationship. Afterward, each partner rewatches the recording alone, pausing it every time they remember what they were actually feeling at that moment and writing it down. Then each partner watches their partner's recording and tries to guess, moment by moment, what their partner was feeling. The overlap between the guess and the real, self-reported feeling is the actual measurement. That method is precise enough to produce genuinely reliable individual differences. Some people are simply better at this than others, across repeated testing. But it's also precise enough to reveal the limitation mentioned earlier. A method built around two people who already share a history, a shared vocabulary, and an enormous amount of prior context about each other is measuring something real, but something considerably narrower than reading people in general. A stranger on a train shares none of that scaffolding. The tense phone call that follows you into the shower, the commute, and a meeting that has nothing to do with it has its own distinct structure, and it happens in two stages. First, an initial emotional reaction, largely automatic, arriving before you've had time to think. Second, and completely separately, how long that reaction gets allowed to keep running once it has arrived. That second stage is where rumination lives, replaying a conversation, rehearsing what should have been said differently, extending a feeling well past the moment that produced it. Two people can have an identical initial reaction to the exact same phone call and end their day in completely different places because one of them ruminates and one doesn't. That's not a difference in sensitivity. It's a difference in what happens after the sensitivity has already done its job. But something even stranger happens in a fourth scene, the one that has nothing to do with anyone's mood at all. The party, the crowd, the exhaustion with no dramatic story attached to it. This is where a genuinely different trait enters the picture, one that gets confused with emotional empathy constantly, despite overlapping with it only partially. Researchers call it sensory processing sensitivity, sometimes described in popular language as being a highly sensitive person. This is a documented, measurable difference in how deeply a nervous system processes incoming stimulation of every kind: sound, light, subtle social cues, even a person's own internal reactions, not just emotional stimulation specifically. Turn the volume up on everything arriving through the senses at once, and a loud, crowded party becomes exhausting for reasons that have nothing to do with catching anyone's sadness. One simple way to start telling the two apart in your own life. Notice whether the exhaustion tracks the number of people and the amount of stimulation in the room, or tracks the emotional intensity of the specific people present, regardless of how many of them there are. A quiet room with one person in real distress and a loud room full of relaxed strangers will drain these two systems in opposite directions, even though both might get described afterward with the exact same sentence. That wore me out. All of this machinery has to run somewhere physical, inside an organ doing all of it constantly, for every person encountered in every room without ever being asked to. And it's worth being honest here about what neuroscience can and cannot currently say about it. Because one particular finding has been used to explain empathy to the public more than any other for the last 3 decades, in terms considerably stronger than the underlying research supports. You've almost certainly encountered the claim that mirror neurons are the reason empathy exists, the missing biological piece finally explaining why one person's pain can become another person's pain too. Here's where the story gets more complicated than the popular version admits. The discovery itself has an almost accidental origin story, the kind documentary footage loves. In the early 1990s, a research team in Parma, Italy, led by Giacomo Rizzolatti, was recording individual neurons in a macaque monkey's premotor cortex while the animal reached for pieces of food, mapping which neurons fired during which specific hand movements. Almost by chance, a researcher reaching for their own piece of food in front of the monkey noticed the exact same neuron fire, not because the monkey moved, but because it watched a human hand perform the same action. That accidental observation became one of the more cited findings in modern neuroscience. The original finding was real, and it remains real. A specific population of neurons in a monkey's premotor cortex fired both when the monkey performed a hand action and when it watched another individual perform that same action. Genuine, replicated, reasonably well understood as one piece of a larger puzzle. What happened afterward is a long chain of extrapolation, from a narrow motor matching system observed in one species, doing one specific job, all the way to a sweeping public theory of human emotional understanding, empathy, love, even morality. Each additional step added confidence the original evidence never actually earned. None of this means nothing physical happens when a person feels empathy. Brain imaging consistently shows overlapping activity between directly experiencing an emotion and watching someone else experience it. It means the tidy one-sentence explanation circulating the most widely, mirror neurons did it, is considerably less settled than its confidence suggests. It's worth asking why that particular myth has survived this long. A simple, physical, single-mechanism story is enormously satisfying compared to the messier truth. Multiple, only partially overlapping neural systems, working somewhat differently across different people, in ways still actively being mapped rather than settled decades ago in one elegant experiment on macaque monkeys. Clean answers spread faster than accurate ones. That's true in science journalism just as reliably as anywhere else. Which brings up the deeper question sitting underneath most of the others. Were you born this way, or did you become this way? It's tempting to want a clean answer. The honest one is that framing it as strictly either-or is itself the trap. Twin and family studies do find a meaningful genetic contribution to traits connected to emotional sensitivity, heritable, in the precise sense that some portion of the variation between people across a population traces back to genetic differences. But notice what a heritability estimate cannot do on its own, which might be the more important half of this. It cannot tell you that environment doesn't matter. A trait can be substantially heritable across a population and still be highly responsive to environment in any individual life, because those are genuinely separate questions. In fact, one of the more interesting findings in this territory involves something researchers discovered almost by accident. Some people respond to life experiences much more strongly than others, for better and for worse. Psychologists call this differential susceptibility. The same genetic predisposition can produce a struggling, overwhelmed adult in one environment and an unusually attuned, resilient one in another, depending almost entirely on what that environment actually provided. There's a popular metaphor for this worth sitting with because it reframes the whole nature versus nurture question rather than just splitting the difference. Some people are dandelions, resilient in almost any environment, not especially responsive either way to how good or bad their surroundings happen to be. Others are orchids, doing considerably worse than a dandelion in poor conditions and considerably better than a dandelion in excellent ones. Neither is the stronger plant in any general sense. They simply respond to environment differently. This idea, developed largely through the work of the psychologist Jay Belsky and his collaborators, marked a genuine turning point in how researchers think about sensitivity. For decades, the dominant framework in psychology treated heightened environmental responsiveness almost entirely as a vulnerability, a risk factor to be minimized, something that made a person more susceptible specifically to harm. Belsky's contribution was to point out that the same statistical logic that predicts greater harm in bad environments should, if taken seriously, also predict greater benefit in good ones. It took years for that second half of the prediction to get tested properly. Once it held up, in study after study, which is precisely why differential susceptibility is now treated as a genuinely two-sided phenomenon rather than simply another word for fragility. Think back to your own childhood for a moment. Was there someone in your life who seemed to notice everything, every mood shift, every unspoken tension, long before anyone explained it to them? That question isn't rhetorical. It's exactly where the next part of this goes. Picture a toddler, not yet able to speak in full sentences, tracking a parent's face the way an adult might track an incoming weather report. For that child, in a very real sense, it is one. Children raised in unpredictable environments, where a caregiver's mood can shift without warning, often develop an early, finely tuned vigilance toward emotional cues. At the time, that vigilance was a genuinely useful survival strategy, not an overreaction. Here's the part that surprises most people. Two children raised by the same unpredictable parent don't necessarily walk away with the same version of this skill. What tends to matter most is the specific texture of unpredictability each individual child experienced, which is exactly why siblings raised in the same house can grow into very different adults. Picture two specific children in that same house. One learns to read a parent's footsteps on the stairs, adjusting their own behavior before the parent even reaches the room. A sibling, positioned differently in the family, or simply built with a different temperament, might instead learn to tune out entirely, going quiet and internal rather than watchful and reactive. Same environment, two different adaptations, both entirely reasonable responses to the same underlying instability. This entire line of research traces back to work most people have at least half heard of, attachment theory, developed by the psychiatrist John Bowlby in the decades following the Second World War, and tested experimentally by his collaborator Mary Ainsworth through a now famous procedure called the strange situation. In it, a toddler plays in a room, a caregiver briefly leaves, a stranger enters, and researchers observe in careful detail exactly how the child responds to the caregiver's return. Most children fall into a small number of well-documented patterns. Some seek comfort easily and settle quickly. Some resist comfort while still clearly wanting it. Some seem to ignore the caregiver's return altogether. But a smaller group show something harder to categorize, approaching and pulling away in the same movement, as if genuinely unable to decide whether the returning caregiver is safe. Researchers have a name for the most extreme version of this: disorganized attachment. It describes a situation where a caregiver is simultaneously the source of comfort and the source of alarm, leaving a child with no single coherent strategy to run, and a strong incentive to get extremely good, extremely fast, at reading which version of that caregiver just walked into the room. That skill can persist for decades, quietly, long after the original reason for it has faded. An adult who still reads a room in seconds, still senses trouble before a word confirms it, may be carrying forward a strategy that made complete sense at 7 years old and never received the memo that it isn't always necessary anymore. None of this is meant to diminish what these experiences cost the people who carry them. It isn't offered as a way of explaining away anyone's alertness as just anxiety or just old trauma, phrases that tend to minimize far more than they clarify. A threat detection system built for a good, understandable reason doesn't stop being real just because the reasons behind it have receded with time, which leads to a genuinely useful three-way distinction most people carrying the empath label have never had spelled out clearly, and one worth writing down somewhere because it will keep being useful long after this video ends. Being a highly sensitive person is about depth of processing across all incoming stimulation. It's a documented, measurable trait, not a diagnosis, and not something that appears in any clinical manual. Being especially empathically attuned is a separate matter of specifically emotional and social sensitivity. And what looks like either one in a given moment might actually be anxiety, a threat detection system running quietly in the background, producing hypervigilance that closely resembles deep attunement, but is functionally organized around danger rather than connection. Picture someone who softens their tone and checks a partner's face constantly during a disagreement, describing it afterward as simply caring deeply about the other person's feelings. That could be genuine attunement. It could also be anxious appeasement, driven by a fear of conflict rather than an accurate read on what the partner actually needs. And these two processes can produce nearly identical behavior while pulling in opposite directions when it comes to what would actually help. Here's one rough way to start telling them apart in your own life. Attunement driven by genuine care tends to feel effortful, but not frightening. Tiring sometimes, but without a sense of danger attached to getting it wrong. Attunement driven by anxiety tends to carry a specific undertone of threat underneath it, a sense that something bad will happen if the red is missed, even when nothing about the situation obviously justifies that level of stakes. It's also worth being direct about what the highly sensitive person trait is not, since the label carries a scientific-sounding weight that can mislead if left unexamined. It is not a diagnosis. It doesn't appear in any diagnostic manual used by clinicians, and no professional body has established a formal, highly sensitive category, the way conditions like generalized anxiety disorder are formally established. It describes one end of a normal, continuously distributed trait. Everyone processes stimulation to some degree. Highly sensitive people simply sit further along that same continuum, not in a wholly separate category. Now, one of the most confidently repeated claims in this entire space, the idea that deeply feeling people are somehow magnets for narcissistic partners, drawn together as if by some kind of emotional law of physics. It's a tidy story, and tidy stories about relationships are usually hiding something more complicated. What research on intermittent reinforcement actually shows is that unpredictable reward schedules, warmth followed by withdrawal, followed by more warmth on a schedule the other person can never quite predict, make a bond harder to walk away from for essentially anyone caught inside that pattern, regardless of how empathic they happen to be. If this mechanism operates in human relationships at all, and the evidence suggests it genuinely does, nothing about it is specific to people who identify as empaths. It's specific to the pattern itself, not to any particular kind of person caught inside it. The practical takeaway isn't watch out for narcissists specifically. It's notice whether a relationship runs on a predictable rhythm of warmth and withdrawal, a pattern worth noticing on its own terms. It's worth adding one further piece to the narcissist magnet story because it's the detail that actually protects someone going forward more than any warning about a specific personality type ever could. The pull of intermittent reinforcement is strongest precisely when someone doesn't know to name it. Once the pattern itself, not the partner's diagnosis, but the specific rhythm of unpredictable warmth and withdrawal, has an actual name attached to it, it becomes considerably easier to notice while it's happening, rather than only in hindsight, months or years later, trying to reconstruct what kept pulling you back in. A more distinct and considerably more common cost shows up without any narcissistic partner involved at all. The sense of being responsible for everyone's mood in a room, arriving even before a word gets exchanged. Not everyone feels this. Some people notice a friend go quiet and simply let the quiet be, assuming it will pass or isn't theirs to manage. Others feel something closer to an obligation switching on automatically and start managing it immediately, often without deciding to. Researchers studying this specific pattern sometimes describe it through the lens of what's called an external locus of control over other people's emotional states, a felt sense that someone else's mood is, at least partly, one's own responsibility to regulate, rather than something that belongs entirely to the other person. This felt sense can develop for entirely understandable reasons, often traceable to exactly the kind of childhood environment discussed earlier, where a caregiver's mood genuinely did require managing for the household to stay stable. The strategy made sense once. Whether it still needs to run in an adult life with different stakes is a separate question worth asking deliberately, rather than by default. Here's what that costs, made concrete instead of abstract. Picture someone who, across a single ordinary week, absorbs a coworker's low mood on Monday and stays late helping without being asked. Checks in repeatedly with a friend going through a hard patch on Wednesday, softens an entire family dinner around one relative's bad mood on Saturday, and spends Sunday quietly replaying whether they said the right things all week. None of those moments looks dramatic on its own. Ask that person at the end of the week what they did for themselves. And the honest answer is often nothing comes to mind. Not because nothing happened, but because every hour spent managing someone else's mood felt too small, too ordinary, too much like simply being a decent person to register as an expenditure at all. That accumulation is often where burnout enters the conversation. And here's where a specific, appealing story needs a careful correction. I burned out because I'm an empath, as though heightened sensitivity itself were the direct, sufficient cause. The evidence points somewhere more specific and more useful. It isn't raw sensitivity that predicts burnout most reliably. It's a particular pattern of absorbing someone else's distress as though it were one's own, what researchers call personal distress, as opposed to empathic concern, which stays oriented toward the other person's welfare rather than curling back around one's own discomfort. Picture two hospice workers, both sitting with a dying patient's family on the same difficult afternoon. Both feel the full weight of the room. One leaves the shift able to describe in detail what the family needed and whether it was provided, oriented outward, even while feeling the loss deeply. The other leaves replaying their own reaction, wondering if they seemed compassionate enough, privately relieved when the shift ends, oriented inward, even though from the outside both looked equally present and equally moved. Two caregivers can feel equally deeply, work equally hard, and end up in genuinely different places after a year because one of them has learned, deliberately or by accident, to keep those two things separate. This is worth connecting back to a phrase that shows up constantly in caregiving professions specifically: compassion fatigue. It's frequently described as though compassion itself were the thing running out, like a resource with a fixed, depletable supply. The research described here suggests a more precise and more hopeful reframe. What actually runs out is the capacity to keep absorbing personal distress unmanaged, not the capacity for compassion itself. Compassion, properly separated from personal distress, tends to hold up considerably better over time than the popular phrase implies. So, is there an actual way to stay engaged with someone else's suffering without absorbing it wholesale? The research says yes, and it comes down to a learnable skill, not a fixed trait. Perspective taking can be trained. Emotion recognition can be trained. And something researchers call self-other distinction, staying clearly aware of where someone else's feeling ends and yours begins, even while fully engaged with them, can be strengthened directly, the same way clinicians, hospice workers, and crisis counselors are trained to do difficult emotional work for years without collapsing under it. Role clarity helps too, and it comes down to one simple question, asked before stepping into someone else's pain. Am I here to fix this, or am I here to witness it? Those two postures require very different things from you. A huge amount of caregiving exhaustion comes specifically from offering fixes to people who wanted witnessing, which leaves the caregiver doing more work than the situation called for, while the other person often ends up feeling less understood, not more helped. Picture the difference directly. A friend calls, upset about a conflict with their sibling. One response. A string of suggestions, each one requiring effort to generate, effort the friend never asked for, delivered with real care, but landing as a subtle message that their feelings are a problem needing to be solved rather than an experience worth simply being present for. A second response, reflecting back what was heard, asking one or two questions that help the friend think it through themselves, and only offering a suggestion if directly asked. The second response is, in almost every controlled comparison researchers have run on supportive communication, both less exhausting for the person giving it and more satisfying for the person receiving it. A rare case where the lower effort option is also the more effective one. There's one more distinction worth adding before moving on, because it closes a loop several of these mechanisms have been circling. Whether the driving force in any given moment is genuine empathic concern, anxious appeasement, personal distress, or simple sensory overload, the same underlying question keeps reappearing in a slightly different costume each time. Is this response actually serving the other person? Or is it primarily serving my own need to feel like a good, caring person in this specific moment? Neither answer is shameful, but knowing which one is actually operating, honestly, changes what kind of practice would actually help. If several of these mechanisms sound familiar, the childhood vigilance, the personal distress, the fixing instead of witnessing, remember, this is only a condensed version. The book walks through each one with the complete evidence, the full research trail, and considerably more practical detail than 80 minutes can hold. It's also worth naming, carefully and without diagnosing anyone listening right now, that some of what gets called being an empath can, in specific cases, overlap with recognized mental health patterns, a general style of relating to others marked by faster shifting, more intense emotional reactivity, or a pattern more consistent with clinical anxiety than with empathy specifically. This isn't offered as a way of pathologizing sensitivity itself. It's an invitation to keep that possibility open rather than defaulting automatically to whichever explanation feels most flattering. There's a practical, useful line worth drawing here, even without turning this into a diagnostic checklist. A trait like heightened sensitivity tends to stay relatively stable across different situations and doesn't, on its own, typically produce significant day-to-day distress or dysfunction. A clinical pattern tends to look different. More sudden shifts, more disruption to relationships or daily functioning, and often relief rather than resistance when the person is finally connected with a trained clinician who can properly assess what's actually happening. If sensitivity ever crosses into territory that feels less like, this is simply how I experience the world, and more like, this is actively making my life difficult to manage, that's the specific signal worth bringing to a professional, rather than a video or a book. So far, this has been about where the feeling comes from. What comes next is stranger. A run of the most widely repeated claims about empaths tested one at a time against what the evidence actually shows. Each of these gets the same treatment. The claim, why it feels true, even to intelligent, careful people, what the evidence actually shows, and a verdict stated plainly rather than hedged into meaninglessness. 8 claims in total, each one popular enough that you have almost certainly heard at least one of them stated as settled fact at some point by someone who sounded entirely confident while saying it. One ground rule underneath every single one of these. A claim doesn't get rejected here because it sounds mystical or accepted because it sounds scientific. It gets tested against actual published research, ideally replicated by more than one independent team. Where the evidence is thin or mixed, that gets said plainly too, never dressed up as more settled than it actually is in either direction. It's worth understanding briefly what replicated by more than one independent team actually means in practice, because the phrase gets used loosely in a lot of popular science content. A single study, however carefully designed, can produce a result purely by chance or through some quirk of its specific sample that doesn't generalize. A meta-analysis solves this by gathering every available study on a given question, weighting each one by its sample size and methodological quality, and combining them into a single, far more reliable estimate. When a claim in this list gets described as tested through a meta-analysis, that's the process being referred to. Not one research team's opinion, but a pooled, weighted summary of an entire field's worth of independent attempts to answer the same question. Start with autism, because few claims travel as widely or land as unfairly as the idea that autistic people lack empathy. It shows up in offhand comments, outdated textbooks, workplace assumptions about who will or won't understand a colleague's distress. Here's why it feels true even to well-meaning people. Autistic communication styles often differ visibly from neurotypical ones in eye contact, facial expression, the timing of a response. Observers frequently mistake a difference in outward expression for an absence of internal experience. That's the same mistake that shows up throughout this entire discussion, whenever behavior gets used as a stand-in for what's actually happening inside someone. The actual research says something more precise and more interesting than the popular version. Autism is associated on average with measurable differences in cognitive empathy, accurately inferring what someone else is thinking. But effective empathy, the capacity to actually feel with someone, frequently shows no reliable group difference at all, and in some studies runs just as strong or stronger than in the general population. When researchers measure these as separate subscales, instead of averaging empathy into one single score, the picture that emerges is a split, not a deficit. The verdict: the popular claim is false as stated. The accurate version is more specific and considerably less damning than the version that actually circulates. Picture a specific common moment this misunderstanding produces. An autistic coworker receives news that a colleague's parent has died and responds with a brief, practical comment about workload adjustments rather than an expected outpouring of sympathy. Onlookers read that as coldness. What frequently sits underneath it instead is a person who feels the loss just as intensely as anyone else in the room, but who processes and expresses that feeling through a different channel, practical support rather than emotional display, and who may also be working harder than anyone realizes to correctly infer what response is socially expected in a moment that doesn't come with an obvious script. The feeling was there. The visible signal simply didn't match what observers were primed to look for, and the entire misunderstanding traces back to exactly the assumption this section just spent time correcting. Here's a stranger, more unsettling possibility. Can someone read you with total accuracy and use that knowledge without any concern for your welfare at all? Research on psychopathy and related traits suggests yes. Cognitive empathy, the accurate reading, can operate independently of both effective empathy and concern for another person's well-being. A small number of people really can understand exactly what would move you, and use that understanding instrumentally, without any of the caring most people assume has to come bundled with real understanding. A caution belongs here, stated with the same weight as the finding itself. Psychopathy and its associated traits are dimensional, clinically specific constructs requiring careful, trained assessment, not a casual label for an unpleasant coworker or an ex over dinner. Most people who behave selfishly, even repeatedly, are nowhere near this clinical picture. It's worth adding one further layer to this particular finding because it's easy to walk away from it with the wrong takeaway. The existence of people who can read accurately without caring doesn't mean accurate reading and genuine caring are usually separate. In the overwhelming majority of people, across the overwhelming majority of interactions, they travel together, reinforcing each other. Better understanding tends to produce more accurate compassion, not less. The psychopathy research describes a genuine, documented exception to that general rule. It was never meant to describe the rule itself, and treating it as though it applies broadly does a disservice to how rare that particular combination actually is. Next, lie detection. This one feels almost self-evidently true to a lot of highly attuned people because catching a friend's mood shift really does happen fast enough to feel like a kind of radar. It's a short, intuitive step from there to assuming that same radar catches deception too. But this is one of the most thoroughly tested claims on this entire list. Decades of pooled research involving professional lie catchers, customs officers, trained interrogators, and ordinary untrained participants across dozens of independent studies. The consistent finding: people on average detect deception at rates only barely above chance, somewhere in the low 50s against a 50% baseline. Self-identified empaths show no measurable advantage, including over the professionals. Confidence in one's own lie-detecting ability correlates poorly with actual accuracy across every group tested. The people most sure they can tell are not, on average, any better at it. The verdict here isn't a matter of nuance. It's simply not true for empaths or for anyone else, and the confidence surrounding it is, if anything, a warning sign rather than supporting evidence. It's worth pausing on why this particular finding tends to land so uncomfortably, more than most of the others on this list. Believing you can reliably spot a lie is, for a lot of people, part of feeling safe in relationships and negotiations generally. A quiet, background confidence that dishonesty won't slip past unnoticed. Losing that belief can feel less like updating a fact and more like losing a form of protection. But the more genuinely protective habit available here is arguably better than the one being given up. Verifying claims through evidence and consistency over time, rather than trusting a felt sense of certainty the research shows isn't reliable, works regardless of anyone's particular gift for reading faces. Have you ever been completely certain someone was lying to you and later found out you were wrong? Hold that memory for a second because it's more common and more revealing than most people assume. Then there's the sense of absorbing someone else's energy. A mood shift that seems to move from one body into another the way heat moves through a wall. Someone walks into a room after a difficult phone call, says nothing about it, and within a minute your own mood has dropped, as though something physically moved from their body into yours. This one feels especially convincing because the language people reach for is so specific and so consistent across completely unrelated individuals. I absorbed their energy. I picked up on something heavy. That consistency isn't a coincidence. It's exactly what a well-documented, ordinary process predicts. No validated scientific construct corresponds to energy as a distinct, transferable substance comparable to how heat or electricity moves between two physical objects. What the evidence does support robustly is emotional contagion, running through facial expression, tone of voice, posture, and subtle cues processed largely below conscious awareness. Genuinely real, physically explicable, and entirely distinct from an unmeasured force passing between two people in a room. The verdict: the experience is completely real. The explanation isn't. Swap energy for emotional contagion picked up through channels you're not consciously tracking. And the whole experience still makes sense, minus the unfalsifiable substance. There's a reason this particular substitution matters more than it might first seem. Once energy gets treated as an actual transferable substance, the natural next step is trying to block it, cleanse it, or protect against it, often through practices with no more evidence behind them than the substance itself. Once it gets correctly understood as emotional contagion, an entirely different, evidence-based toolkit becomes available instead. The same pause before responding and self-other distinction tools already covered, which have actual controlled research behind their effectiveness. The relabeling isn't just a matter of scientific accuracy for its own sake. It changes which solutions are even worth trying. The sixth sense claim gets the same direct treatment, and it feels true for a related reason. A correct hunch about an incoming problem is memorable in a way that dozens of incorrect hunches never are, because nobody keeps a running tally of the times they felt something was about to go wrong, and nothing did. One piece of research settles the underlying question about as clearly as psychology settles anything. A large combined effort by researchers named Gallack, LeBeouf, Nelson, and Simmons, published in 2012, pooled data from several thousand participants across multiple independent replication attempts, testing precisely this kind of anomalous perception under tightly controlled conditions. The result came back indistinguishable from zero. No reliable effect anywhere in the pooled data. The verdict: the correct hunches you remember are real memories of real moments. They're just not evidence of a sixth sense, because the incorrect hunches you don't remember outnumber them by a margin large enough to erase any actual signal, once someone actually counts. There's a useful, related concept worth naming here, because it explains why this particular illusion is so hard to shake, even after hearing the evidence: confirmation bias. The well-documented tendency to notice and remember information that confirms an existing belief, while letting disconfirming information slide by, largely unregistered. It isn't a flaw unique to people who believe in a sixth sense. It's a universal feature of human memory, operating on every belief a person holds, which is precisely why deliberately counting the misses, not just the hits, is the only reliable way around it. For this claim, and for nearly every other belief a person might want to actually test rather than simply feel confident about, then the number repeated with the flattest confidence of all: only 1 or 2% of people are empaths. It's always delivered in the tone someone might use to state a population's average height, as if someone, somewhere, actually went out and counted. Here's the uncomfortable truth behind that number. Nobody has ever defined empath precisely enough to actually measure a population percentage in the first place. That isn't a small gap in an otherwise solid literature. It's a structural problem with the underlying question itself. A percentage requires a category defined precisely enough that someone could, in principle, go count it. This category has never had that. Compare this to how actual, well-established psychological traits get measured, and the gap becomes obvious. Sensory processing sensitivity, discussed earlier, has a validated questionnaire behind it, tested for reliability across thousands of participants, with clearly defined scoring thresholds that different researchers can apply consistently. Empath has none of that. No standardized instrument, no agreed threshold, no peer-reviewed prevalence study anyone can point to as the actual source of the 1 or 2% figure. Ask, the next time this number comes up anywhere, for the specific study it traces back to. In every documented case so far, the trail simply goes cold. And here's the story that shows up constantly in writing about empaths, usually offered as a kind of consolation. A difficult childhood didn't just wound someone, it built something valuable in them. A heightened capacity for sensing and caring about other people's suffering that a comfortable childhood never would have produced. It's worth taking seriously why this framing has such staying power. For someone who genuinely lived through a hard childhood, a story that assigns retroactive purpose to that difficulty is deeply appealing, in a way that's easy to understand. But appeal isn't evidence. The actual research on adversity and empathy paints a considerably messier picture. Outcomes depend heavily on whether a child, during the hardest years, had even one consistently available, emotionally responsive relationship. A grandparent, a teacher, a family friend, anywhere in the picture. Where that single stabilizing relationship existed, heightened sensitivity sometimes developed alongside genuine resilience. Where it didn't, the same adversity more often produced hypervigilance organized around threat, without any redemptive framing attached to it at all. The verdict: adversity doesn't reliably produce either outcome on its own. What surrounds the adversity is doing most of the actual work, which means the redemptive story, however well-intentioned, is quietly giving credit to the wrong variable. It's worth sitting with what that actually means for someone who has already told themselves a redemptive version for years. It doesn't mean the difficult childhood didn't matter, or that whatever sensitivity developed afterward isn't real and valuable. It means the credit belongs somewhere more specific than the hardship itself, to whatever stability, however small, existed alongside it, and to whatever the person themselves did afterward to build something usable out of what they were given. That's a less poetic story than "my pain made me this way," but it's a considerably more empowering one because it locates the real cause in something a person actually had some hand in, rather than in suffering for its own sake. Finally, the brain scan, the compelling image circulating alongside articles about empaths showing supposedly which brain belongs to a highly empathic person, as though the difference were as visible and settled as a scan revealing a fracture. It feels convincing precisely because it borrows the visual authority of medical imaging. A colorful scan showing more activity in one brain than another looks, to most viewers, like the kind of proof that shouldn't need further explanation. But individual brains vary enormously in overall structure, which makes using any single scan to settle a question about one person's personality a genuinely shaky enterprise. Test-retest reliability across repeated scans of the exact same person, examined across multiple meta-analyses, comes in well below what would be needed to treat any single scan as a dependable individual measure of anything. Scan the same person twice, weeks apart under similar conditions, and the two results often diverge more than most people expect from something presented as a stable biological fingerprint. The verdict: brains do differ, and some differences plausibly relate to emotional processing, but no single scan shown alongside a confident caption can currently tell you or anyone else whether you're wired to be an empath. There's a broader lesson buried in this specific finding, one that applies to nearly every brain scan claim circulating in popular psychology content generally, not just this one. A single scan is a snapshot, taken under specific conditions, of an organ that is constantly changing based on mood, sleep, recent events, and simple day-to-day variability that has nothing to do with any stable personality trait. Treating that snapshot as a permanent, defining feature of who someone is confuses a photograph for a biography that closes the run of specific, testable claims. 8 of them, tested one at a time, and 8 verdicts landing somewhere between not supported and considerably more specific than the popular version. If there's one thing worth taking from this entire section, let it be this. The confidence with which a claim circulates online has essentially no relationship to how well it holds up once someone actually goes and checks. Notice something else about that list of 8, now that it's complete. Not one of the corrections required dismissing the underlying experience as imaginary. Every single one left the actual felt experience intact, while relocating the explanation somewhere more accurate. That pattern is not a coincidence. It's the entire method this whole discussion has been built on, applied consistently, claim after claim, rather than switched on and off depending on which conclusion felt more comfortable. But this isn't the whole story. Everything up to this point has treated empathy as something worth having more of, carefully, sustainably, without the costs already covered. Here's a harder, less comfortable question worth asking before turning toward anything practical. Is more empathy actually better? As a general rule, unchecked empathic distress, feeling someone else's pain so intensely that managing your own discomfort quietly takes priority over actually helping them, can make a person measurably less effective at the caregiving they're trying to provide, not more effective. The distinction between empathic concern, oriented outward, and personal distress, oriented inward, matters here more than almost anywhere else in this entire discussion. More of the first is generally good. More of the second is often actively counterproductive, both for the person feeling it and for the person they're trying to help. Given that, a natural question follows. Can this capacity actually be deliberately trained the way a person might train a muscle, rather than simply being a fixed trait someone either has or doesn't? Consider what too much empathy actually looks like in a real profession before answering that. Physicians in training are sometimes found across longitudinal studies tracking them from medical school into practice to show a gradual decline in measured empathy over the course of their training, not because they stop caring, but because unmanaged personal distress, absorbed from years of exposure to suffering without adequate tools to process it, eventually pushes many of them toward emotional distancing as a self-protective reflex. That decline isn't evidence that empathy is dangerous. It's evidence of exactly the gap this discussion keeps returning to: enormous capacity for feeling with no matching training in how to carry it sustainably. The honest answer is yes, in specific, well-documented pieces, not as one single undifferentiated skill that either exists or doesn't. Perspective-taking exercises measurably improve accuracy in reading what someone else is actually thinking. Compassion training, kept distinct from simple empathy training, has been shown in controlled studies to increase prosocial, helping behavior while simultaneously reducing the personal distress that so often accompanies intensive caregiving. Training people to care more while suffering less in the process. That sounds paradoxical until you remember that compassion and personal distress are, once again, separable systems rather than one dial turned up or down together. The two skills tend to work best layered together rather than pursued alone. Accurately reading what someone else is experiencing first, then deliberately choosing an outward-facing response instead of an anxious, self-protective one. Some of this training already has names attached to specific, tested programs rather than being a vague aspiration. Compassion. Cultivation training, developed at Stanford, and cognitively based compassion training, developed at Emory, are two well-documented examples, both built around structured meditation and perspective-taking exercises, both tested in controlled studies against comparison groups, and both showing measurable increases in prosocial behavior alongside measurable decreases in personal distress. None of this requires years of retreat-style practice. Most of the published programs run in a matter of weeks, in ordinary group settings, which is worth knowing if the idea of training empathy has always sounded like something reserved for monks rather than something available to anyone willing to practice a specific, structured skill. So practically, on an ordinary day, when someone else's feelings start to feel like they're taking over, what actually helps? 4 specific things, each matched to a different mechanism already covered. When the problem is catching someone's mood too fast to intercept it, emotional contagion, a brief pause before responding, even just a few seconds, gives the slower, more considered system time to catch up with the faster, automatic one. In practice, that can be as simple as one internal phrase. That's their feeling arriving in me. Let me check what's actually mine before I respond. When the problem is rumination, the phone call that won't leave, deliberately setting a concrete boundary on how long a feeling gets to run, a specific cutoff rather than a vague intention to let it go, measurably shortens how long a reaction persists. I'll think about this until the end of my commute, and then I'm done for today. Followed by actually redirecting attention when that marker arrives. When the problem is sensory overload from a crowd rather than absorbed emotion, the fix is almost entirely about managing incoming stimulation directly, scheduled breaks, quieter spaces, planned recovery time, not about managing anyone else's feelings at all. Stepping outside a loud party for 5 minutes isn't a failure. For someone whose exhaustion is coming from stimulation load, it's simply the correct tool for the actual problem. And when the problem is losing the edges of yourself entirely inside someone else's experience, the self-other distinction skill described earlier is the single most relevant tool available. In practice, that often comes down to silently narrating mid-conversation which parts of what you're feeling actually originated with you. The tightness in my chest right now is my reaction to hearing this, not a sign that I need to fix it for them immediately. Have you noticed which of those 4 failure points shows up most often in your own life? The fast contagion, the rumination, the sensory overload, or losing your own edges entirely? Most people, once they hear the 4 laid out separately, recognize immediately that they've been treating all of them with the same one-size-fits-all advice, which is exactly why that advice so often hasn't worked. This is worth dwelling on for a moment because it's probably the single most practically useful idea in this entire discussion. Generic advice for empaths, get more sleep, set boundaries, practice self-care, isn't wrong exactly. It's simply aimed at no mechanism in particular, which makes it about as useful as generic medical advice aimed at no specific illness. Someone whose actual problem is sensory overload doesn't need a boundary-setting script. They need less stimulation. Someone whose actual problem is rumination doesn't need more sleep. They need a concrete stopping point for a thought that won't stop on its own. Matching the fix to the mechanism, rather than reaching for the nearest generic wellness advice, is the difference between a tool that works and a tool that simply feels like it should. There's a newer wrinkle worth understanding because it didn't exist when most of the classic research on empathy was first conducted. What happens to all of this once it moves onto a screen? The same mechanism that makes a vague, flattering description feel personally accurate the first time someone reads it doesn't disappear online. It gets amplified by systems built to maximize engagement, which have discovered without any particular intention to do so that content confirming a person's sense of being deeply sensitive keeps them watching noticeably longer than content that doesn't. Watch what happens after even a single pause on one of these videos. Within a day or two, the feed has usually located several more, each one slightly more specific and slightly more flattering than the last, each one arriving with the same quiet, cumulative message. This is you, more precisely than you've ever had it described before. None of this requires believing anyone built these systems with the specific goal of convincing people they're empaths. An engagement-optimized feed combined with an ordinary psychological bias produces exactly this outcome on its own. Picture the actual sequence, because it's more specific than the algorithm knows you. A viewer pauses 3 extra seconds on a video titled "Signs You're an Empath." That single hesitation, multiplied across millions of users doing the same thing, becomes a training signal. Content like this keeps people watching. The system doesn't need to understand empathy or care whether the claims are accurate to learn that lesson and repeat it. It only needs to notice that the pause happened and serve more of whatever produced it. Repeat that process a few hundred times across a few days, and a viewer's feed can look, from the outside, disturbingly personalized. Not because anyone studied that specific person, but because a purely statistical process arrived at the same destination by a much simpler route, which connects to something worth stating plainly because it changes how a person relates to their own self-description going forward. There's a real difference between noticing a pattern in yourself and calling that pattern your identity. I notice I experience empathy-related traits pretty strongly, is a description. I am an empath is a claim about who you fundamentally are. And the second one, once adopted, tends to become quietly self-reinforcing. Research on this process has found that people don't just passively receive confirming or disconfirming feedback about an identity. They actively seek out situations and interpretations that confirm it, a well-documented process researchers call self-verification. Picture someone who has adopted empath as a core identity, rather than a loose description of a tendency. They'll often begin unconsciously filtering ambiguous moments through that identity, reading a stranger's neutral expression as evidence of absorbed distress, or interpreting their own ordinary tiredness after a long day as proof of having picked something up from someone else when a simpler explanation was sitting right there the whole time. None of this makes the underlying traits any less real. It means the label sitting on top of them can start doing work of its own, sometimes narrowing how a person interprets their own reactions, rather than simply neutrally describing them. There's a simple, low-cost habit worth naming here as a counterweight to this entire process. Before assigning a new experience to an existing identity, pause long enough to ask whether a simpler, less identity-confirming explanation might fit just as well. Tiredness might just be tiredness. A stranger's blank expression might just be a blank expression. That single pause doesn't require abandoning any label a person has found genuinely useful. It just keeps the label answerable to reality rather than the other way around. Before the final synthesis, one last, genuinely stranger question. Because any current conversation about empathy increasingly can't avoid it. Can a machine be empathic? A conversation with a fluent, responsive AI system can produce a startlingly specific feeling that it understood you. Not just parsed the words you typed, but actually grasped what you were going through, sometimes responding more patiently and more articulately than an exhausted friend might at 11 at night. That feeling is worth taking seriously as a feeling, while being honest about what it can and cannot tell you about what's actually happening on the other side of the exchange. There is currently no agreed-upon method, scientific or philosophical, for determining whether anything resembling subjective experience is present in these systems at all. Which means the honest answer, for now, is not yes and not no. It's an acknowledgement that this runs directly into one of the harder open problems in philosophy of mind. Not a gap closed by one more study or one more clever test. Philosophers have a specific name for the deeper puzzle sitting underneath this question: the hard problem of consciousness, the difficulty of explaining why any physical process, biological or artificial, should be accompanied by subjective experience at all, rather than simply happening in the dark, unfelt by anything. Nobody, working on any side of this debate, currently has a satisfying answer to that question, even for human brains, let alone for silicon. What can be said with more confidence is something narrower. A system trained on enormous quantities of human written language will, almost by construction, become extremely good at producing the linguistic patterns that accompany understanding, whether or not anything resembling understanding is present underneath those patterns. That's worth knowing, not as a way of dismissing the comfort such a conversation can genuinely provide in a difficult moment, but as a way of holding two things at once. The comfort can be real and useful, and the question of what's actually happening on the other side of the screen stays genuinely, honestly open. Think about the last time a conversation, with a person or otherwise, left you feeling truly heard. What would change about that memory if you knew for certain that nothing on the other end was actually experiencing anything at all? For a lot of people, surprisingly little changes. The value of being heard turns out to live, in large part, in the listener's response, not in some verified inner experience behind it, which is either a comforting thought or an unsettling one, depending on how you look at it. And this discussion isn't going to pretend there's a single correct way to feel about that. So, pulling all of this back together, one final time, the same way every single claim in this video has been handled from the very first minute. Take the real experience seriously and hold the explanation to a higher standard than a feeling of certainty alone can provide. Go back to the kitchen. Two people who stopped talking the moment you walked in. What actually produced that instant, wordless certainty that something had happened? Some combination of fast accumulated pattern recognition, reading posture, silence, the specific quality of an unfinished sentence, layered with whatever baseline sensitivity to social cues you happen to carry. Real, explicable, not evidence of anything mystical. Go back to the coworker in the meeting. The knowledge that something was wrong before a single word confirmed it. Empathic accuracy, potentially sharpened by experience with that specific person or by a general vigilance built somewhere earlier in life. Possibly both, in proportions that shift depending on who's sitting across from you on a given morning. Go back to the phone call that followed you through your entire day. An ordinary emotional reaction extended by rumination. The second stage, the one actually under your control once you know to look for it, and the one part of this entire sequence that a simple, deliberate stopping point can genuinely change. Go back to the party, the crowd, the exhaustion with no dramatic story attached, quite possibly nothing at all to do with anyone's mood. Sensory processing sensitivity, an entirely separate system, doing its own separate work, running quietly underneath a room that, to everyone else standing in it, looked like nothing more than an ordinary, pleasant evening. Go back to the friend's bad month that lingered into the next morning. Cognitive empathy, emotional contagion, and empathic concern, 3 different systems showing up together or separately depending on the moment, none of them requiring the other 2 to be present. And no single one of them, on its own, sufficient to explain the whole weight of what stayed with you overnight. And go back, finally, to being told you were too sensitive. Maybe that was true in the narrow technical sense of carrying a nervous system that processes more deeply than average. Maybe it was actually anxiety, misread by everyone involved, including yourself. Maybe it was hard-won vigilance built during a genuinely difficult childhood, doing exactly the job it was built to do long after the danger that built it had passed. Or maybe, as is true for a great many people, it was some honest combination of all 3, none of them canceling out the others, all of them true about you at once. None of these 6 moments needed defending at any point in this discussion because none of them were ever in question. They happened. They were real, whatever produced them. What was in question the entire time was whether a single explanation, a single label, a single tidy story could account for all 6 at once. It can't. Cognitive empathy, emotional contagion, empathic concern, sensory processing sensitivity, hypervigilance shaped by an unpredictable childhood, ordinary anxiety, and genuine attunement built through years of deliberate practice. These are separate, independently documented processes. Any real moment of feeling everything at once is usually some specific combination of several of them, not evidence of belonging to one single rare category of person. That's the actual offer here. Not a tidier conclusion, not a checklist that finally settles whether you're an empath, because that particular question was never built to be answered in the first place. What's genuinely available once the myths get cleared away and the separate mechanisms get named individually instead of bundled together is something more useful than a label, an accurate map of what's actually happening every time other people's feelings move through you, which parts of it can be deliberately worked with, and which parts simply deserve to be understood rather than fixed. It's worth being honest about one more thing this whole discussion has tried to model, rather than just state. the difference between treating an experience as entirely real and treating any single explanation for it as automatically correct. Those aren't the same move, and confusing them is, in a sense, the one mistake sitting underneath almost every myth covered today. What kept needing correction, claim after claim, was never the experience itself. It was the explanation attached to it. Flatly wrong in some cases, considerably overstated in others, or simply not yet answerable given what's currently known. That's not a disappointing place to land. It's a considerably more honest one than either the quiz and checklist version or the everything is a magical gift version this entire discussion started by rejecting. And it's the only version durable enough to hold up against a lifetime of new experiences still to come, rather than needing to be re-explained every time an inconvenient new detail shows up. None of this is a claim that self-understanding stops mattering, or that the 6 scenes at the start of this video don't deserve a name at all. It's an invitation to trade one word for a considerably more precise vocabulary. Cognitive empathy, emotional contagion, empathic concern, sensory sensitivity, hypervigilance, differential susceptibility, self-other distinction. Words that, once you actually understand what each one is pointing at, explain far more about your own life than a single borrowed label ever could. There's a kind of relief available in this that's worth naming directly because it's easy to miss underneath all the myth correcting. A single label puts pressure on a person to be consistently one thing, consistently deeply feeling, consistently drained by the same triggers, consistently fitting a description that was never built with any one specific life in mind. A precise vocabulary removes that pressure entirely. You can be someone whose emotional contagion runs high, but whose rumination is well managed. Someone whose sensory sensitivity is pronounced, but whose empathic accuracy with strangers is unremarkable. Someone who built genuine hypervigilance during a hard childhood and has since deliberately turned a meaningful portion of it into trained, chosen attunement. None of those combinations needs to add up to a single tidy label. They only need to add up to an accurate description of one particular life, which was always the more useful goal. That vocabulary and everything behind it is what the complete book actually walks through, written by Dr. Dilaram Demiralay, a clinical psychologist who built this entire project around one working rule: never state a claim more strongly than the evidence behind it actually supports. 35 chapters, each one taking a single experience or a single widely repeated claim and holding it up against the actual research, the same way this video just did across one continuous sitting, but with the space to go considerably deeper into every mechanism only briefly touched on here. The full research behind the childhood attachment findings. The complete walkthrough of what can and can't be trained. A far more detailed toolkit for staying engaged with other people without quietly burning out in the process. A full reference list tracing every claim back to its original source. For anyone who wants to check the evidence directly rather than take any of it on faith. And a glossary walking through every technical term used along the way, from cognitive and affective empathy through differential susceptibility and self-other distinction, so that none of the science ever has to feel like it was written for someone else. This isn't a book that promises to tell you what you are. It's a book that hands you back the 6 ordinary moments this video opened with, and everything genuinely known about what produces them, so that you can finally stop reaching for a single word to explain something that was always, honestly, several things at once. One last thought before this ends. Somewhere in the next few days, you will probably notice one of the 6 scenes from the start of this video happening again, in some ordinary version, in your own life. A room that feels different the second you walk into it. A friend's mood that lingers a little longer than it should. A crowd that leaves you quietly depleted for no dramatic reason at all. When it happens, notice which specific mechanism seems to be doing the work. The fast contagion, the accurate read, the rumination, the sensory load, the old vigilance, or some genuine mixture of several at once. That single habit, repeated enough times, does more for actual self-understanding than any label ever could, borrowed or otherwise. If any part of what you just heard sounded like your own experience, described more precisely than it usually gets described anywhere else, the kitchen, the meeting, the phone call that wouldn't leave, the party that drained you for no dramatic reason, the friend's bad month that followed you home, or being told one time too many that you were too sensitive. That's exactly what the book is there for. It's available now in paperback and ebook with the link in the description below. And whichever version you pick up, it starts exactly where this video did, in that same quiet kitchen. And it doesn't stop taking the question seriously until the very last page.